Welcome to Kentucky Horsepower, the official podcast of the Kentucky Automobile Dealers Association. Hi, good day, everyone. This is Jason Wilson with the all-new Kentucky Horsepower podcast. Happy to have you with us today, and happy to have a guest that is not a stranger to me. I've come to know through the years as a unbelievable resource for us in automotive and tracking all things automotive. And it's Kevin Tynan. Kevin Tynan is with Bloomberg Intelligence. He's the senior automotive analyst, and you might have seen him on the news. He speaks quite a bit to things automotive. And Kevin, thank you for joining us here. Appreciate you taking some time to join us on our podcast.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and congratulations in the new role. Looking forward to it.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah, Kevin and I have spoken through the years while in Virginia. And in fact, just before we started this, we were thinking, boy, it's been about a year since we had our last conversation in this sort of format. And not much is going on, obviously. It's been kind of a quiet year, yeah?
Yeah, I was getting a little bored with nothing going on.
Yeah, exactly. So, look, I thought it would be great to have Kevin on. And those of you who don't know Kevin, aren't familiar with Kevin, he has spoken at the last, I think, 3 VADA conventions and was due to speak last year. Unfortunately, it was canceled, obviously, like everybody else's was. But Kevin brings a wealth of information. He really analyzes this industry very closely and brings a unique perspective. And the members that heard him in Virginia certainly always appreciated his discussion and the things that he brought to the table. So I figured, Kevin, we'll just jump right into it. What we're seeing in the news all over right now seems to be every other day there's some new manufacturer proclaiming when they're going to make the move to EVs and what year that's going to be and what that looks like. So let's dive into that. I don't recall ever a time in such a short period of time that we have seen this much discussion on the forward movement of EVs. What is your take on this? What are you seeing from your perspective?
Yeah, really, really interesting topic. And, to your point, it's something that really dominates the conversation among Bloomberg analysts and Bloomberg clients. And like you said, there's a lot of talk about it, but what's interesting is that timeline, by 2035, we're still talking a decade plus out there. And really what it comes down to, Jason, when you look at it, if we're 2% EV in the US now, that means we're 98% not EV, excuse me. And vehicles are lasting longer, when you look at the existing fleet and the average age around 12 years, so yep. 98% of what is sold is going to be on the road. And you're taking some buyers out of the addressable market for a period. And so this is really something that, while there is a lot of talk about it, I'd even call it hype at this point. And I'm, part of a media company in Bloomberg with our news and our TV and our radio. I'm not sure that the actual unit volume is anywhere near where the hype is at this point, and it's very forward looking. But at the end of the day, where the money is being made is still, and I've been pounding the table on this, is that shift to truck from car.
Yep.
We're at record prices. We're at record truck mix, and nobody talks about that. That's where all the profitability is. And I even joke, that GM and Ford and Stellantis are so profitable on their pickup truck mix that it's made Tesla profitable because they've had to buy regulatory credits from them. And that's really what's underpinned their pre-tax income to this point.
Yeah, and that is an interesting point. And you don't hear a lot about that, obviously, as it relates to Tesla and how they are able to be profitable and do some things. And it's through measures as you just spoke of. It is interesting as we look at now, there's a couple thoughts that I have, I'd be interested in getting your take on. So, EVs, that has one aspect of an alternative option to power vehicles. And of course, there's hydrogen, there's been natural gas. So I guess one of my questions is, from your perspective, with all this discussion and moving forward to EV, is that where we're going to actually land, or will it be something different? Not unlike back in the day when it was VHS versus, beta. I mean, are we going to see some different iterations of alternative vehicles, or is EV where it's going to go?
Yeah, it seems like obviously that EV has the advantage, right? Because we have plugs everywhere.
Right.
So the infrastructure build out will probably happen faster. The commitment to hydrogen, when you think about, like, Toyota has talked about hydrogen for
Yep.
years and that it's the better alternative. And when they bring that up, they usually get shouted down, by the EV crowd. But Toyota's a smart company, and they've done a lot of things over a
That's
very,
right.
very long period of time. So, they're either very smart or very dumb on this. And but I think that when you think about the infrastructure and what's in place and what's coming and where the investment is going, it looks like the commitment is to EV. What that means in terms of unintended consequences for the grid or for
Right.
costs down the road, still remains to be seen. But it just seems like the easy option is, well, there's electricity everywhere, never mind how we generate it to this point. But essentially everybody will plug it in, we can move up our percentage of renewables, and it really looks like there's such a head start with electrification that that's probably going to be the first thing. But there is talk and there is belief that the even longer term view, hydrogen may make a legitimate play.
Sure. And of course, to your point earlier, there's time. I mean, none of this is happening overnight. This is not a tomorrow type of initiative. This is going to be a very much a long view. The other thing about EVs, if you think about it, because you also hear the argument from those saying, look, it makes up such a small percentage, 1%, 2% type of, as the overall market. But if you look back on what's been offered, particularly by the OEMs, Americans still love vehicles. They love a look of certain vehicles, a feel. There's an excitement about buying a vehicles, and the OEM offerings to date have not exactly been sexy offerings or market changing offerings. When I think of the Bolt, the Leaf, and no offense to anyone that likes those vehicles or buys those vehicles, but as a whole, it's certainly not in the league of some of the other vehicles that have a little bit more excitement to them. What is your take on that?
Yeah, and that's a whole show in and of itself, Jason, right? So, and
Yep.
I've been talking about this for a long time. And it even goes back to where we are now with some of the talk of extending EV credits or offering more federal tax credit for buyers of
Yep.
EVs, or government spending on infrastructure. And really, for years, I've been sort of yelling and screaming that, look, you can incentivize the consumer with federal tax credits, and you can put a charging station on every corner. But at the end of the day, if General Motors or Ford or anybody, except for Tesla, because it doesn't matter to them, is
Right.
losing money on the products that they're selling, they don't want to sell them. And that's why, to your point, and if you call them compliance vehicles, especially around people from General Motors or Ford, or
Right.
they take offense because these are people on those programs that are committed to them, and rightly so, and they do a fantastic job with them. But at the end of the day, as you walk up that corporate ladder, you're saying, the higher you go, if you're losing $10,000 to $15,000 per unit, how many do you really want to sell?
Right.
And the answer is less than zero. So that's where we are, in that the government keeps talking about incentivizing the consumer, and it doesn't matter until the manufacturer sees that path to profitability. So,
Right.
and I've written, and it would probably never happen because it's actual money out of the pocket. But I say, instead of giving the consumer $10,000, why don't you give the manufacturer $10,000 per unit to get them closer to profitability? Now
Right.
you'll get a legitimate effort, and you'll get products that they want to build, they want to sell, that
Sure.
people want to buy. But until that point comes, I think you're going to get, this slow walk towards electrification. Now, the government is the wild card, and we've seen, when European governments or the Chinese government gets involved in their region specifically, what the impact will be. The US government really hasn't been that aggressive with penalizing automakers or forcing the hand of an
Right.
automaker to build things unprofitably and have to sell them. The emphasis has been on the consumer, right? And
Right.
it doesn't cost them money out of the pocket. It's just some tax revenue that doesn't come in, and we'll make it up somewhere else. But really, the motivation is not as punitive as it would be, say, in Europe, where there's billions and billions of dollars of fines on the table if you don't move in this direction. And we just don't have that here.
Right. No, that's a good point. And as an aside from that, you think about when all this came to be, this discussion really got amped up no pun intended, regarding the electrification side of things, was when we had a new administration come in. It seems to me, as the new administration was come in and there were discussions of policies going more green and improving those things, is when we heard a lot of this uh, really bold predictions and things coming out. Would it change the other way, or a different party slow this trend or reverse some of this dialogue? What is your take on that?
Yeah, I think, the key thing again is, and maybe it's just my finance background is, you just have to follow the money. And if there's money to be made, automakers will
Yeah.
do it. And why I say it doesn't matter to Tesla, because they're really the one company who profitability hasn't mattered, right? The company's been valued as the most, the most valuable automaker for some time,
Right.
selling 500,000 units in a year and only really being profitable on the regulatory credit sales. And in this past quarter on Bitcoin sale,
Right.
um, but every other automaker still has an eye on the P&L, and it matters, right?
Right.
So, it can change, but I think it'll be motivated by that profitability. And when you look at what the government has done up until this point with giving the consumer federal tax credits, you only have two automakers that have hit the 200,000 unit phase out goal. One is Tesla, obviously, and the
Right.
other is General Motors. And like 80% of the General Motors eligible credits went to buyers of the Chevrolet Volt, the plug-in hybrid, not the battery electric Bolt.
Right.
So again, to that point, you have a company like the former Fiat Chrysler, now Stellantis, has sold 50,000 EVs. The CEO came out and said, Sergio Marchionne, when he was alive, please don't buy this. We lose money on every one.
Right.
So,
Right.
so you can give 200,000 credits at $10,000 each, but if the manufacturer doesn't have a product or see the path to profitability, they just refrain from building it and selling it.
So ultimately, it still comes down to supply, demand, profitability, and how that all works, regardless of what platform you're on. Which leads me to just sort of another conversation I'd like to get your take on. Dealers have been doing well. Obviously, there's sales have been great. Dealers are making grosses again on both new and used, but now we are in the midst of an inventory crunch on both sides due to chip shortages, and then we have used vehicles being driven up. And I read something the other day that, in fact, used vehicles, before the discussion was just turn, get them on your lot, turn them as quick as you can. Now there's some discussion. Well, keep them. They may go up in value as things move forward on its current trajectory. What's your take? What are you seeing from an inventory standpoint, or what are things dealers need to be thinking about over the next several months?
Yeah, and I think even going back to early 2020, second quarter of 2020, when production of new vehicles basically stopped, and
Yep.
now the supply demand balance tipped, in the favor of manufacturers, and we started to see pricing rise, and it really put a fine point on, the value of truck versus car, right? And that a lot of the car nameplates, especially for the domestic manufacturers, had already been discontinued. We're sort
Yep.
of in that process of phasing out. And then when production was interrupted, it was like, well, what's the rush to restart things that are already discontinued? And let's focus on, on the profitable stuff, which is really the truck side of the business. And I think we've talked about it where I said, look, if you're going to dig out of a hole, you're going to use your best shovel.
Right.
And that's SUVs and pickup trucks. And that's really what's happened. So now, where when we get into 2021 and this chip shortage, first of all, you have manufacturers already on that, you could call it favorable side of the supply and demand balance, right? They were already short on supply. So at the time where it was like, okay, you guys are at full capacity and we can start overproducing and discounting, it's like, nope, can't, no chips.
Right.
So it's kept them on that side of prices continuing to rise. And I'm not saying, my conspiracy theory is that the chip shortage isn't as bad as it seems, but
Right.
it could come at a worse time than, already coming out of 2020, where you were short supply, and you've seen this ramp in average transaction prices and margin per unit. And it's like, hey, we're selling a lot of really good stuff and not a lot of really bad stuff or
Right.
unprofitable stuff. We've been trying to do this for decades,
Right.
and we're finally there. And then what that's doing too, as you see, average transaction prices overall continue to rise because of the mix, that's pushing a lot of that addressable market into the pre-owned segment, where they say, well, look, I'll let depreciation work for me, and then simply supply and demand balance there is going to drive prices higher as well. But really, and we've talked about this too, is that dealers, retail was really moving towards the pre-owned segment even before
True.
COVID-19 and the
Yep.
pandemic started, because it's a way to differentiate your product. It's there's not one on every corner, and you can kind of if you're buying well at wholesale, there's some margin to be made there, and
Right.
that's gone away to a certain extent. And I talk to auction people all the time, and the dealers will know this, is that dealers are paying retail at wholesale now.
Right.
And then it's like, well, what do we charge at retail? So the used car market is pretty interesting right now. And I think what it's actually doing is going to start to push people towards private sellers for a little bit of a time in here, because can't afford the new vehicle market, the used vehicle market's going higher. Let me just go to somebody who needs to get rid of this thing or doesn't understand the dynamics of the market right now. And that's where you have your opportunity to get something well bought.
Yeah, it's look, to say last year was interesting is an understatement. I think it seems we're going to be continuing this in this trend for the foreseeable future, as we continue to climb out of not only the pandemic but the other challenges that we just discussed and mentioned. So a lot of change in this industry as a whole, which I'd like to wrap up with one other item as it relates to change and maybe a change in direction. There's been a lot of discussion regarding auto shows, the future of auto shows, what that could look like, even prior to this, right? You had some of the OEMs jumping out of some shows, being more in other shows. And this last year has sort of been a pause. There's been a couple of shows, not many, but what is your just opinion? I know you're a car enthusiast, as seen by your background there. We've talked before. I know you're a car guy through and through. What is your take on what that looks like?
Yeah, and I would say, I would look at it almost from the other side, that, some of the commentary on auto shows was from the perspective of automakers pulling out and what's the benefit. And I'm saying, you know what, I think it was from oversaturation. And if you look at even just the Detroit show, right? It gets moved out of January and it's supposed to go later in the year or even in the
Right.
summer. And you can use, well, that was really because of CES, right? So you have the Consumer Electronics Show in January in Las Vegas. Right. And I remember we would go from CES directly on a plane from Vegas to Detroit. I wouldn't even come home.
Right.
Right. So you go to Detroit and then so you're 2 weeks on the road, and, and with all the automotive stuff that winds up being at CES, you have automakers saying like, well, okay, now we have to send this whole, this whole entourage to Vegas, and then the next week is in Detroit, and it's just too much. We're going to pick one or the other. And that's why, essentially, in my opinion, why Detroit moved. So it wasn't that people didn't want to go to Detroit or didn't want to go to an auto show. And if you think about the number of people that are in Detroit in January, there was demand. And I think there is demand. We go out to the Woodward Dream Cruise in Detroit in August, and it's amazing how many people there are. SEMA in Las Vegas at the beginning of November, it's wall to wall people. And I was just saying, I went to, there's a show in Pennsylvania that I like to go to around spring is the kickoff. Couldn't get near the place. I went Friday, no parking, I basically drove 2 hours and turned around and came home because there was no, and it was great to see. I mean, there was people out there, and it was a swap meet and a car corral. So I think there's a legitimate future for auto shows. I think what you might see, or what the organizers need to do, is to sort of focus a little bit more narrowly. Like, New York is sort of unofficially the luxury show, and Detroit is unofficially the domestic manufacturers, and California becomes unofficially, the import brands and things like that. So I don't think the auto show is dead by any stretch, at least if you talk or go to shows or talk to enthusiasts. I mean, we want to be, and actually, Jason, for the past year, that's the part that kills me. Like, I love what I do more than you'd ever know, but sitting at a desk writing about cars, even with the background and the guitars everywhere that I have, is like, it's not the same as being out and meeting with people like you and the dealers and seeing cars and sitting in them and driving. And it's just, it's the best part of the job. And I think that will always be the case.
Well, I'm hopeful. I'm as someone that's been involved with shows for years. I believe in shows. I've seen the power of shows. There's nothing better than seeing people get excited about new things that are coming out. And as we're talking about all these new products coming out, it would seem to me it makes sense now more than ever moving forward to do auto shows. Yesterday, I was fortunate enough. One of our local dealers here, Kane Ford, brought over the new EV Mustang and just said, "Hey, you got to check this out." And I have to tell you, it was impressive. It was fun. I was able to do my own little ride and drive. And if that's the future of what EV could look like, I think dealers have reason to be excited about it. And I think shows would be a great place and a great way to showcase that type of product offering.
Yeah, I've been fortunate in that while I have been sort of isolated at home, I've been getting, test vehicles, and I've had the Mach-E.
You have connections, you know people, you can do this.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and like I said, it's probably the best part of the job now is actually, while we're talking, somebody just dropped something off, a new Lexus for me to test. And it's like, I can't wait to run outside and go give it a look, and grab the keys. So, I think that enthusiasm, if anything, through this period has been pent up. And I think once we're allowed to start moving about, like my fingers are crossed. I'll go to Woodward Avenue this summer, whether it's officially on or not, just to go and see the cars and the people. And my fingers are crossed for SEMA in November.
Yep.
And then it just tick them off as we used to, one after the other.
Well, I think you're right. Look, pent up demand is the word right now. You're starting to see more events. Kentucky's having their annual convention this year, as is several other states. That's starting to happen back up again, which, by the way, would love to have you speak at one of our conventions.
Oh, absolutely.
Forward. So we'll
I'm on 24-hour call when you get it together. Sure.
There you go. Well, look, I appreciate your time today, Kevin. I feel like we've discussed some really interesting topics. And as always, you have a keen insight into this type of information. And I find it to be very beneficial, and I'm sure our members will as well. So thank you so much for your time. We'll stay in touch and continue these conversations as things percolate and change in the market. And again, you're just a great resource for us to be able to tap into. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's always my pleasure. And hopefully we can get together. I give you a big hug.
That sounds good. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining this edition of Kentucky Horsepower, and we'll see you down the road.